Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Hello, America, and welcome to Pivot Point, a show bringing you diverse views on the news. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. Well, last night was the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It was my very first time ever going, and it was a fascinating experience indeed. I would say that it was like a madhouse, a zoo, if you will, and the celebrities were out in full force. You had Sharon Stone. You had Kerry Washington, you had, you name it, you had it in terms of Hollywood, Claire Danes, Hollywood and Washington. And so, the question becomes, how surreal was it with regards to the issues? Interestingly enough, the president did give his monologue, and he hit on a couple of doozies, everything from, his leisure time in terms of how he's spending his golf days to certainly, issues of how he is working with the Congress. He had a lot of hits on the Republicans. And I think that Conan O'Brien actually did a decent job of spoofing the president. Interestingly enough, though, there was no mention. There is still shame in Washington because there was no attempt to make light of where we are in terms of our nation's attempts, especially Congress and the Obama administration's attempts to impose austerity measures on the nation. There was no joking about the chain CPI, about the issue of actually having old people, disabled individuals, surviving orphans pay for deficit reduction through cuts to benefits to young people. And so fortunately, there is still shame in Washington because there was no discussion of this. But certainly it was certainly a sight to behold. Peter, what is going on with Rogan Rogoff?
So what we have here is the main thing that underlies a lot of the austerity cuts. The study that they point to a lot is been kind of proven to be not the best study in the whole world.
So, I would like to welcome to the show George Zornick. George actually writes for The Nation. He actually focuses on Congress, and he focuses on a lot of the policy issues that we focus here on Pivot Point. Welcome, George.
Thanks for having me.
So as you well know, the Washington policy players, the brokers, have been really talking about a grand bargain ever since Obama actually came into office in 2009. And so we've seen elements of them trying to get to this grand bargain where you have cuts in entitlements, and entitlements they refer to as Social Security, Medicare, and they throw Medicaid in there, while also looking for tax increases. And the Rogan-Rogoff study was used by many deficit hawks as a justification for austerity measures. Have you been following that debate?
Yes, very closely.
So tell me what your assessment is about where we are with regards to debunking the very rationale, the very scholarly, quote-unquote, rationale for the need for austerity in the first place.
Well, what's interesting about this study, once it came out that there was a major mathematical error and the conclusion that it reached was not actually the correct conclusion. Some people in Washington are treating this as if, now suddenly we know that austerity doesn't work. Mm-hmm. When in fact, the evidence has been pretty strong for many years now. A lot of people have been saying it. The IMF did a study showing that it wasn't working in Europe. And so it's interesting now to see the actual, progenitors of the intellectual debate who defend austerity now blaming this on a spreadsheet error. It kind of reminds me of, after the Iraq War kind of proved to be the mistake that everyone said it was all along, the administration started trotting out these CIA assessments and intelligence things and saying, oh, look, you know what? some jerk, some bureaucrat at the CIA messed this thing up, and so.
But there is, I mean, this form of groupthink. I mean, we've seen in Washington. We saw it with, I think, the lead up to the war in Iraq, where, you know, I think everybody outside of Washington knew that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. And yet you saw these folks who were like, and the media was co-opted. You know, the Washington power brokers played along. And we went into war against our better judgment. Now we're actually seeing the, you know, we already know that the rationale for austerity does not work, and yet we saw the same drive towards austerity. We still see the effort with the chain CPI and some Medicare changes, et cetera, with the president actually arguing this week that we can actually get out of the sequester by having a balanced approach to deficit reduction.
I mean, what's interesting and what I think a lot of people, and particularly a lot of Democrats, don't understand is that even Obama's best quote-unquote offer on the sequester, so no chain CPI, a mix of spending cuts and tax reform that targets the wealthy, even that is per se austerity. I mean, if you're raising taxes and cutting spending, that is what austerity is. Now, I don't particularly think that, you know, enacting the Buffett rule or limiting deductions on the wealthy is a bad policy choice, and I don't think it would have a huge impact on the economy. But that is what austerity is. But what he's pushing more recently, of course, is a much more damaging form of austerity, one that instead of taking a little bit of money out of the top of the economy, really takes a lot of money out of the pockets of seniors who need it badly.
The disabled,
orphans,
veterans.
Many veterans, yeah. And I think it's something that, you're right, there was no joking about it last night because the Democratic Party is very divided on this. The people who favor chain CPI are probably outnumbered, but are prevailing right now because of where they are. But you have many Democrats in Congress who are openly criticizing the decision to enact chain CPI. Many others who are probably remaining silent for the moment, but are uncomfortable with where this is going. And if you believe the reports, there are people in the White House who are very skeptical of this approach. But there is a core group of people inside the White House and to a lesser extent in Congress who think that the correct strategy to deal with the sequester is to make Republicans look unreasonable, to propose things that they should like.
So what you're arguing then is that some people in the White House actually believe that this is a good political strategy to actually propose cuts to benefits that seniors rely on to put food on their table, that orphans rely on to make sure that they have a roof over their heads, that veterans rely on to make sure that they can continue to afford the extra health care that they need, for example, as a political strategy to make the president look good?
I think it's a crazy strategy, and I think it's one that they're now realizing is not as easy as they thought it would be. I think one thing that happened here is that the people inside the White House who proposed this underestimated what the pushback would be from, you know, the quote-unquote professional left, and also to the extent to which it would actually gain some traction and cause problems for them. I think there was a definite, I mean, this administration from the beginning has been somewhat disdainful, again, of what they dubbed the professional left, somewhat derisively. And I think that they figured they could propose this, and they knew they would get the pushback. And actually, they wanted the pushback because they think to the David Brooks set, to the David Gregory set, you know, they look reasonable. The left is mad at them. The right is mad at them. And so this mythical middle in the country will say, you know what, Obama's really got a good head on his shoulders. He's coming up with a sensible debate. And this goes back to what this is the Obama theory of governing, all the way back to that speech in Boston in 2004. There are no red states. There are no blue states. And he thinks that this is his image, his ultimately will be his legacy.
Well, I think that this is interesting because I'm glad you said mythical middle, because it is mythical in the sense of, even though you're saying that the Obama administration and staff have been derisive of the professional left, the reality is he's been elected on a leftist agenda. He gets into elections and he is saying all of the right things. They actually go populist in election years. But when they get into governance, then they become these centrists, if you will, who actually are very, very, very responsive to big business interests and actually quite dismissive of progressive values and certainly progressive policies.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one's naive about the fact that, of course, governing and campaigning are different things, but I think they take this to an extreme that is unacceptable and many more people should consider unacceptable. You know, he didn't He never mentioned chain CPI once during the campaign, once ever. And now all of a sudden, as soon as the election over, this is something they want to enact.
Well, and in 2008, he mentioned public option many times, and then once it came time to negotiate, it was the first thing off the table.
Exactly.
So anyway, you just recently authored an article that talked about the top 5 myths around the chain CPI. Could you walk us through them?
Sure. One is that it's not, the top myth really is that this is not a benefit cut, that it's just, people who defend it, and there are some academic defenders on the left in D.C. who say, really, this is just a better way for the government to measure inflation. That right now, basically, our inflation measures are overly generous because when the government is considering, how much to, for example, increase the cost of living calculations in Social Security, the formula that they use now, regular CPI, says that looks at, so when the price of a good goes up, they count that as inflation, period.
Yeah, right.
And obviously, as many listeners know, what chain CPI does is try to take into account substitution effects. So yeah, maybe the price of steak goes up, but people will start buying chicken instead. So really, practically speaking, it's not inflation because people don't end up spending more money. They buy something else. And to a limited extent, that's probably true. But where it gets very tricky is when you talk about seniors, because seniors spend 3 times as much as the rest of us as you would expect on medical care. And the disabled. They need medical care.
Right.
So this is not a matter of replacing steak with chicken. If you have a medication that you need and the price goes up, the price goes up. There's no substitution there. And that takes up quite a bit of their budget. Healthcare, again, increases at a much higher rate of inflation than foodstuffs or other commodities. So the idea of applying this quote-unquote more accurate formula to what seniors and the disabled and veterans need is somewhat questionable, very questionable. And what's interesting too is that so for veterans, they've exempted all veterans programs from this. Now veterans still get hit because 1 in 5 people on Social Security are a veteran, and there are other back-end ways that they get hit. But any means-tested program for benefits, any means-tested benefit program for veterans is exempt from this. So you have to say, well, wait. If this is really more accurate, if all we're doing is scaling back a windfall that people don't need, then why are you exempting veterans from it?
So they are exempting means-tested programs like SSI and TANF and other poverty programs where you actually have to show how poor you are in order to get a benefit. But some veterans' benefits are not exempted, like retirement benefits. Some civil service benefits, like if you are with FERS, the Federal Employee Retirement System, they're also affected because their government-issued benefits also have that cost of living adjustment determined by the CPI. What I find interesting is that the Obama administration claims that the change is not going to affect how they actually calculate the poverty level. However, just this last week, the Congressional Budget Office published an article on their website actually talking about that it will actually affect the poverty level, which then in turn slows down the rate of growth of those programs, meaning that you have less people eligible for programs like SSI, programs like TANF, and other programs that are means tested in the future. So the program gets hit in that way.
That's a really crucial point. That the poverty level is important in so many ways. This, the big half of Obamacare, and of course this is the big contested part now, is the Medicaid expansion to the states, and it expands Medicaid in the states to, I believe it's 130% above the poverty level. So if you're messing with the poverty level, that's hundreds of thousands, millions of people who won't get Medicaid benefits where they otherwise would have. SSI, you're exactly right. The problem with excluding SSI from chain CPI, it's good that they do, but because the poverty level is already probably too low, you have about 9 million people who are poor or near poor who don't get SSI benefits. They rely just on Social Security if they're disabled or elderly, and they still see the cut. And there's another about 3 million people who are what's called dual eligibles. They draw from SSI and Social Security, so if chain CPI is enacted, the SSI part of their benefits are protected, but they also rely on Social Security, and then they get in trouble there.
And actually, that same CBO report actually talks about how the chain CPI also affects Medicare. It slows down certain doctor payments, and it also has the effect of limiting the people who are eligible for certain programs like low-income drug subsidies and other things, because it has the same effect of slowing the growth, by making fewer people eligible. And so, this has implications, a ripple effect across the entire system. It saves the nation money, but at what cost?
At what cost? Exactly. I mean, you could just toss, and this actually is the Republican plan, you could just toss everyone off Medicare. You'll save a ton of money. But what's the point? I mean, at what cost do you do this? Or, you could just completely shut down the Pentagon and have no armed forces. Well, okay, you save a lot of money, but...
So what was one of the other of the five
Well,
issues?
I think there's an emerging consensus among policy people that it's bad policy, and it is a benefit cut, and it does hurt people. But what's a little bit harder to prove and game out, and that's provable. You can look at the tables and you can do the math. Social Security Works has a great set of documents and fact sheets on how much of a benefit cut this will be to people, even with the protections that they have. But what's harder to game out is the political myths.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what we were talking about before, the idea that by proposing something that is quote-unquote reasonable, at least in the eyes of Washington centrists, that it's something that the public will suddenly gravitate to, and that it won't hurt the Democratic Party going forward.
Yeah.
I think we're starting to see the first signs that truly this is a myth when you saw the head of the Congressional Republican Re-election Committee come out and say, by proposing change CPI, Obama is trying to harm our nation's seniors, and we're going to remind the voters of this in the 2014 midterms. And I think they will. We have every reason to believe that they will.
Well, now all the smart people in the White House, they didn't anticipate that?
They did not. Or either they did or they thought that Republicans wouldn't be that craven, and I think that's another thing that we've seen them, aside from dismissing the voice of the professional left, they always seem to underestimate how kind of ruthless the Republican political operators will be. And that's been a problem with the Democratic Party going back to the George Bush years, and probably quite a bit before that.
Well, let's talk about the Democratic Party, because the president does not have to get reelected again. Yet the Democrats in the House and Senate do, and the House particularly is not in power. And I'm wondering how they expect to be in power if they go down this route of following the president off the cliff with regards to the change CPI.
Well, one interesting thing will be to see if they actually do. I mean, there are bills introduced by Democratic senators in both the House and the Senate, messaging resolutions that say we will not sign on to change CPI. So I'm not sure that if the deal actually comes to a pass, if the Republicans say, okay, we'll take this, which I don't think they will, but that's a separate discussion, will the Democrats actually go along? Will they accept a bill that has change CPI in it?
Well, actually, that's a good point, because I've been wondering, because the president seems to be doing his charm and disarm strategy again. He had the Senate Democratic women over to the White House last week to basically charm them and to discuss, this whole notion of having a budget, package that can actually get us out of sequester. And a part of that quote-unquote balanced budget package is this notion of a change CPI. So he's trying to win the women over into buying into this. But it makes me wonder if they actually think the Republicans are really going to come to the table. And why do you think that they may not?
Well, I think they honestly believe that they would, because even the strongest defenders of change CPI certainly were aware of the downside risk, the political risk. But I think they really believed that they could embarrass the Republicans into coming to the table, because here's Obama going far more than halfway to make a deal. And they had some evidence for the idea that this would work, because that's basically what happened with the debt ceiling a month before. They made the case that Republicans are being irresponsible and extreme by threatening not to raise the debt ceiling. That argument took hold, and the Republicans backed off.
Well, two questions there. Do you think that there are going to be some high-stakes politics around the debt ceiling this next time coming up? And B, is the president risking his legacy by going this route?
I think he is. I think he's risked it. One of the most interesting stories of the Obama presidency is what would have happened, the most interesting counterfactual. What would have happened if Republicans took his debt ceiling deal in August 2011? That was far worse than anything we're talking about now. That deal, as has been widely reported, was to raise the Medicare age to 67, enact change CPI, and to make all of the Bush tax cuts permanent.
All bad policies, by the way.
All terrible policies and unpopular policies. Yeah. And that's what he ended up running on. His 2012 campaign was based on let's push the Bush tax rates back up. Romney and Ryan are going to destroy your Medicare. If that deal had been accepted and Obama had put his imprint on this in 2011, what would the 2012 campaign have looked like?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I mean it was the Democrats actually in December of 2012 that ended up making the Bush tax cuts permanent
Right.
for all but literally the 1%.
Right.
And so I've been thinking that perhaps what we're seeing is the grand bargain not happening in one big deal, but over the course of several small deals.
Mm-hmm. That's what we've already seen. We've seen just this week Congress pass a bill that says the sequester doesn't apply to the FAA, which is fine. Maybe it shouldn't, but there's many things that it shouldn't apply to: cancer clinics, public defenders, Head Start. I mean, everyone knows the list. So, but what that may unfortunately be the first sign of, and one of many things to come, is well-connected, quote-unquote important programs get slowly protected from the sequester. But people who are on Head Start don't have the ability to come to Washington and get that deal for themselves. So the sequester will be slowly dismantled over time, because I don't think Republicans will ever take the chain CPI deal. And I think the deal that Obama's proposing now represents about as far as he can go without just completely losing his own party in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going to happen then is there's no deal, there's no chain CPI, that's good, but the sequester is still a very damaging thing, and people are going to slowly get protected from it, but only the most powerful, only the most connected. And it's going to end up being a really terrible drag on the economy.
Mm-hmm. Morality.
Mm-hmm.
When you think on the big picture about where we are as a nation, I think although Occupy Wall Street was never, I think, a real political force, I think what they were successful in doing is highlighting this notion of the 1% versus the 99%. The fact that we have huge wealth inequality in this country and that it's policy driven in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we know how we got into this deficit and debt situation and know that policymakers in Washington are actually trying to now balance the budget and deficit and debt on the backs of people who largely did not create our fiscal crisis. What does that tell you about where we are as a nation? What does that tell you about the role of morality in politics?
Well, I think it's severely broken at this point, and I think partially it's because the discussion in D.C., even during the Obama era, has been dragged so far to the right that even what many good people, what many good Democrats would tell you is a moral deal, is in fact not, because the terms of the debate are so immoral that even and what they propose is certainly much better. I mean, a chain CPI and some modest cuts is far better than what Romney and Ryan would have enacted. And so, there are people who are in good faith trying to do their jobs and trying to enact what they view as a moral strategy. But in fact, it's not, because the underlying terms of the debate are so immoral. And I think that's and it's perfect that you mentioned Occupy, because that was kind of the response. It was the extra political response to a broken debate. Mm-hmm. And it came immediately after the conclusion of the debt ceiling talks. And I've always had a theory. I mean, the core group of activists was always there. But I think the reason that they caught on, August was the debt ceiling fiasco. Mm-hmm. September was when Occupy really exploded. And I think the reason that so many people in Congress and people across the country and activists and the quote-unquote professional left latched onto it is because they had reached a point of peak frustration with Obama. They had saw him almost give away the farm during the debt ceiling deal, but even if not, create a terrible sequester, stop focusing on unemployment entirely. Mm-hmm. And there was just this frustration that said, this debate has gone off the rails. Mm-hmm. Occupy sort of petered out. The White House took on a much more populist approach in response to that movement and in response to the need to get reelected. Mm-hmm. And what will be interesting to see is if there's another, whether it's Occupy or anything else, whether there's any kind of breaking point over the next 4 years with Obama, where people finally once again say, we've had enough. We've invested enough good faith in him, but the debate is essentially broken. And even if you agree with everything he's doing, even if you can say, well, he needs to do X because of Y, whatever, the debate itself is broken, and we have to get outside of it. I think that will happen, but I'm not totally sure.
Speaking of broken systems, tell us about the Stock Act.
Yeah, this is really one of my favorite stories of the past few weeks, in that it's one of my least favorite things that's happened in Washington. Everyone remembers the Stock Act that was passed a year ago.
Explain it to our listeners. Mm-hmm.
So what it was there was a 60 Minutes report that exposed a bunch of members of Congress and their staffers for profiting off inside information. So the classic example is Spencer Baucus, who was then the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, ranking member. And he got a briefing in 2008 from Treasury officials in the middle of the crash before anyone knew how bad it was. And they came and said, listen, people, that the stock market, Lehman's about to go under, the stock market is in deep trouble. We need you to pass this bill. So Spencer Baucus leaves the meeting, and he goes and buys a bunch of stock options that would basically short the market and pay a whole bunch of money if it goes down, which of course he knew it would, but no one else knew that. So the Stock Act was designed to combat that. It made it illegal for members of Congress and their staffs to profit off what they learn on their job. And it said one of the ways that they'll enforce that is by creating this online database where all staffers and all members of Congress have to file their disclosure forms, their financial disclosure forms online. It gets collated into a big database that's searchable by member, by industry, by investment, by date, so that it'll be very easy to pinpoint what people are doing. These disclosures existed already, but they're literally in the basement of the Senate. You have to go there, ask for the photocopies, or ask to look at the computer. And that was really important because making a law that says members of Congress can't do something is very tricky, and we've seen this time and time again because there's a clause in the Constitution that says the executive branch cannot really prosecute the legislative branch. It's designed to keep them from shutting Congress down and arresting members. In any case, this database was really the thing. So, over the past year since it was passed, there's been this slow, barely noticeable drumbeat that this database is not going to be, people in Congress didn't want it. It also applied to the executive branch as per the requests of Republicans. And they said, well, this is just not good. There's going to be too much information online. We're worried about identity theft and national security concerns. Someone could look up what an NSA staffer is invested in and figure out who they are. And these concerns were largely not borne out by any good government group. They said that's not really a problem, or if it is, we could tailor this narrow exception. Okay, you have a security clearance, you don't have to, what have you. So what Congress did 2 weeks ago, and it's really shocking the amount of hubris that they put into this, especially with all the fanfare that came with the Stock Act when it passed. I mean, you had a ceremony in the White House, wall-to-wall news coverage, you had everyone congratulating themselves. They passed this bill through unanimous consent a week ago without announcing it to the public beforehand.
Voice vote?
Voice vote. They didn't even tell the library, they didn't release the text of the bill until after it had already passed. They did it on a Friday afternoon after the gun bill had gone down. Everyone was talking about that. And it passed through first the Senate and then the House, voice votes. Many people weren't even in town. Many members of Congress didn't even know that it was happening. It was a small rump group in each house that happened to be hanging around and just didn't object to it.
Wow.
And what it did was completely gut this database. It said, all this is optional, and even the stuff that does make it online, even if someone chooses to put it on because they're not mandated to anymore, it shall not be searchable, sortable, or downloadable. So you'll just have data, but you cannot even have a search function in it. You can't search it by date. You would just have to literally
build your own system.
Build your own,
figure
and that's
it out.
very onerous. Maybe some good government groups will end up doing that, but even then it's going to be an incomplete system. So this rips the guts out of the Stock Act. I mean, there's no mistake about it. And every good government group who's monitored this, Sunshine Foundation, Crew, you name it, has said the act is basically worthless.
But
now.
we haven't seen a lot of this reported in the media. I haven't seen it on MSNBC, CNN,
No.
you name it.
The best, as is the case.
And they didn't joke about it last night.
They did not joke about it last night. The best reporting has actually been from The Daily Show. Did this great sketch this week about how terrible it was. But that was it. I mean, and just the hubris was amazing to think that they could just come in and rip out the guts of this act that they all slapped themselves on the back for a year ago, and that nobody would notice. But you know what? No one did notice. It actually worked for the most part.
So, I mean, would you argue that the folks who are responsible for gutting that and getting it passed through Congress are aiding, abetting future criminal activity?
Absolutely. When something, well, now it's not going to be. I mean, it's hard to
say it's criminal if it's not on
Right.
the law as being criminal.
Right. I mean, when this happens again, which we have to assume it will.
It will.
If not next year, the year after, or sometime.
If it hasn't already.
If it hasn't already, if it hasn't been a continuing problem
Right.
since they passed it, it will happen again, and it will be on the shoulders, and it's a bipartisan thing. I mean, to get something through Congress like that, you have to have Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid agree on it. You have to have Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner agree on it to move it through that unanimous consent system.
So that means that both Democrats and Republicans are complicit.
Entirely. And the president signed it. I mean, really, I mean, everyone complains about partisanship, but I think what you should really worry about are the things that everybody agrees on.
That's right.
That's the stuff you have to watch.
That's right. Oh, that you just said something there. I think that's amazing. The last thing I want to ask you about is that your bio actually reads that you worked as a researcher for Michael Moore's Sicko film.
That's right.
I'd like to kind of end by having a short conversation with you about what your research on that film revealed to you about the nature of our healthcare system.
You know, a lot of it was really a sobering experience, and I think everyone who worked on the film would say the same thing, because a lot of what we were tasked to do was find, and people who've seen the movie know, the idea of really, the thrust of it was to tell the stories of people who don't have health care, who get cancer and have to have a bake sale in order to get their treatment. You know, it's the debate in D.C. and even over the healthcare reform was not really conducted on moral terms. It was about politics and
Economics.
entitlement and you know. But so a lot of what we did was just going through the country and trying to find people, and unfortunately it wasn't that hard, finding people who were screwed over and fatally screwed over in some cases by the healthcare system, and to really hear someone, and it doesn't even do it justice to talk about it, but to actually know someone. If you can imagine, if you know anyone, for example, who's been diagnosed with cancer, the terror kind of it and the panic that sets in. If you can just really imagine at that point, instead of going right to the doctor the next day and beginning your chemotherapy, the level of anxiety that's created by having to worry about, can I even afford that? And do I have to spend 2 months asking everyone I know for money before I can get these treatments, or applying to every charity clinic in the country to see who will take me, is really an incredible burden on people that should not be happening in a country as rich as we are.
Right.
When countries who are far worse off than us have all figured out how to just guarantee the basic human right of health care for their people.
I think that what was interesting, my husband and I always talk about a quote. There was a English MP or official that was quoted in the film who said that, who talked about that if a nation can keep people sick with no options, if jobless and hopeless, then they'll never rise up, and then the elite can maintain control.
Absolutely true, and that's, I think, what you see that operating on a bipartisan basis, but you especially see it very latently in GOP politics, where, you know, even after the election, Romney and Ryan both said, well, you know, Obama handed out all these things to young people and quote unquote urban voters, and there really is kind of a latent mindset, I think, particularly among conservatives, that you can't give too much to people. Number one, that they believe they don't deserve, but number two, so that they don't become too powerful. There's this fear on the right that is unspoken always of empowering certain people with even basic rights and dignity, because those are people that they don't want participating in the system. They don't want them voting. They don't want them worried about. They don't want them economically powerful. I mean, that is a real fear on the right. And if you understand that, and then listen to Rush Limbaugh or whoever, Sean Hannity, talk, you understand, that audience understands what they mean.
And they don't want them to be empowered because they feel like it's a zero-sum game, that if those folks become empowered, then they lose their power.
Absolutely. And they really do think that, and they never say it, but it's there if you hear it, that if you kind of bring people into the fold of society who they understand to be not members of society or semi-members of society.
Second-class citizens.
Second-class citizens, exactly. That the system falls apart, and the system right now works to their benefit.
George Zornick, I have really enjoyed this conversation. You know your stuff, and I think that you have fascinating insight. So can I have you on again in the future?
Anytime, I'd be happy to come back.
Okay,
Anytime,
thank you.
really.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful to meet
Really
you.
appreciated it.
All right, take care.
You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. And so with that, we thank George for joining us for that fascinating conversation about what's going on in Washington with regards to the politics of the grand bargain, chain CPI, and other things like the Stock Act. And George, if you want to just stay with me through one more segment, we actually have Phyllis Zolatoro on the phone. She's an activist and Social Security recipient. And Phyllis, are you with us?
I sure am.
Phyllis, I read your testimony. You spoke before the Senate in 2011.
Yes, I did.
And you were arguing that our healthcare system is absolutely and fundamentally broken. Can you walk us through your argument?
Well, I can certainly give you examples. My son had cancer when he was 10 years old. He is now 28 and an 18-year cancer survivor. During the time that he was inpatient in the hospital at Johns Hopkins Children's Center, he had such a severe reaction to chemotherapy that they had to stop the therapy for several days to treat the reactions. And a clerk from the health insurance company called his doctor and said he had to be discharged because they don't pay for a bed for a patient unless they're getting active chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. So he was discharged. I call it kicked out of the children's oncology floor, sent home, and a few hours later was right back in the hospital with a fever of 104 and an infection that could have killed him. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't a doctor at the insurance company, but a clerk who was just going by the rules. My husband, in 2005, had a massive, near-fatal heart attack. He was uninsured. So he got treatment, and he was finally got medical assistance because of the huge catastrophic cost to that illness. But even though he was accepted on SSDI, Social Security Disability Income, it's 2 years before you can get Medicare.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
What do you do for the 2 years? Mm-hmm. Well, since he was getting Social Security at that point, and it really wasn't much because he was only 51, we were getting about $950 a month in Social Security. My son got about $500 a month on SSI due to his chronic illnesses. I was not working. I was taking care of both my husband and my son.
And you were uninsured as well.
I am still uninsured. Mm-hmm. I have always been a full-time but unpaid case manager for my family. And that is really a full-time job. I do work part-time now, mm-hmm. but that's my second job. We applied for Medicaid, and we were told that because of my husband's $950 income, that we were too wealthy to get full Medicaid coverage. Mm-hmm. So during those 2 years, every 6 months, we had to accumulate $3,500 worth of medical bills before Medicaid would kick in and pay for the rest of that 6 months.
Wow.
So each year of those 2 years, we racked up about $7,000 of bills mm-hmm. that we still owe, mm-hmm. and the phone starts ringing at 8:30 in the morning and doesn't stop until 8:30 in the evening, 7 days a week. We are in just about every medical collection agency in the United States.
Phyllis, there are some people who would argue that the Affordable Care Act was made for you. What is your response?
My opinion of the Affordable Care Act, which I think is better than what we have had before, but the exchanges, I believe, are going to be administered by the for-profit insurance companies, which means people will have, in these exchanges, will have large bills that are uncovered because the insurance companies will cover 80% of their allowable fee. What is their allowable fee? We don't know. It's not the doctor's fee or the hospital's fee. So people are going to rack up bills that will ruin their credit rating if they're not already ruined mm-hmm. by not having insurance. It's a really, really frightening situation.
So what is your proposal? What do you think we should have that would meet the needs of the people?
I believe in a national health plan. People run away scared, and I think people want to hold on to their for-profit insurance because they're afraid to lose what they have, going to something unknown to them. But I was in the hospital a couple of years ago. They were checking, they thought I might have a heart problem. I was in the hospital for 3 days, uninsured. I came out with a bill for $4,000. Our friend lives in London. He had pneumonia. He was in the hospital for a week. He came out of the hospital with a hospital bill that was the equivalent of $4 American.
Wow.
And he got superb treatment. He didn't have a waiting line. He was admitted immediately. If other industrialized countries in the world can insure their entire population, why can't we?
George, why do you, because national health care plans work, and we know that from other countries, why is there such resistance? I mean, even with a weak public option, why is there such resistance to giving people the option of actually having that?
I think there's not as much resistance as people imagine, at least in terms of what the public believes if the case is made effectively to them. What many people in D.C. believe, but as with so many things, it goes back to the control that big money and big corporations have in our government. The evidence for a single-payer national health care plan is pretty clear. That debate is kind of almost over because there's nothing else you can say. It's not going to be proven any more than it already has. We've seen it in real life. It's not a theoretical thing, as you mentioned. So many other countries have it. That is basically ended, and I think a lot more people agree with it in theory in the United States than we realize. But it's the big money that's gumming up Congress and will not let it get through.
Phyllis, I was fascinated in your testimony. You indicated that you thought that people should be able to pay into Medicaid. Usually, people talk about making Medicare for all. Or
Right.
Was there a specific reason why you made the Medicaid argument?
Medicaid is really a fantastic system. At least that has been my son's experience and my husband's experience until he was put onto Medicare. It covers everything. I think some of the problem with the system is that the doctors and hospitals are not all connected with each other. If you don't go to the same hospital and see doctors connected with them for all of your medical issues, you can have doctors prescribing tests for something that has been done several weeks earlier. That part of the system is really so disconnected. Also, with Medicaid, with everything being covered, even with Medicare and private insurance, not all insurance companies have certified coders. A lot of bills come in. They don't know exactly what is being billed, and they can deny almost anything. The insurance companies know this, and they're not willing to make changes because it will cost them money.
Okay.
And if 80% of our money that we pay into those insurance companies is supposed to go to medical care, how are the CEOs making multi-million-dollar salaries?
Right. So, as you well know, the for-profit part of our national or of our healthcare, and I say system in quotes because it's a loose confederation of for-profit entities and various other for-profit players. But the issue is for-profit, just like Phyllis said, George, that we've got industry players making huge amounts of dollars off of the health and sickness of a national population. And again, the question of morality comes up. And I'd just like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When you have a system where necessarily the less medical care a company gives, the more money they'll make. I mean, that's just the way it works. And there are many, I would assume, good people and people, good moral people, even if they're not seeing the bigger picture, who work for, they go to school, they get a business degree, they go to work for Aetna. That's their job, that's what they're told to do, and if they can lower the medical outlays, the profits go up, the stocks go up. And so really it's a systemic problem. I mean, it's hard to bash these individual people who are just trying to get by.
Automatons in a larger system, and they only see their slice of the puzzle.
Exactly right. And it's tough. I mean, that's tough to, that's why Congress has one of the many reasons, I mean, aside from all the big money, is that it's hard to just legislate an entire industry out of existence. I mean, if public single-option, single-payer healthcare passed tomorrow, then Aetna and Independent Health and Blue Cross, they all close their doors. So you would obviously have to have something on the back end to help these people, whether it's working for the federal government in administering this new and very large healthcare system, or
there will be jobs.
Retraining.
And it's just about shuffling the chairs on the deck.
Reordering
That's
the
right.
system. Yeah.
Phyllis, you are now an activist. Who are you actually working with? What organization?
Well, actually, I am in the process of starting an organization. The Americans deserve real economic security.
Okay. And where are you in that process?
At the very, very beginning, but it's just become so difficult for so many people, especially with the chain CPI looming. It's a very frightening thing. Now, my family, my husband and my son, have been on Social Security. A couple of years ago, economists decided there was no cost of living increase. So nobody received a cost of living increase in Social Security.
I remember.
Well, the first year, our rent went up $50 a month. And the second year, our rent went up $60 a month. That's $110. We're in the hole, and that hasn't been made up. Now, I am not an economist, but I think a $110 increase in our rent is a cost of living increase.
It is.
And food has gone up, and gas has gone up. I don't know who these economists are, but I think they're either confused or they're not very good economists.
George, Phyllis just laid a scathing, I think, critique and very real critique on the economists like Rogan and Rogoff, who argue for the chain CPI. And she just talked about the instance of where the actual cost of living adjustment that was offered by the government didn't match what the reality was in terms of people experiencing economic increases because of changes in prices. So, I mean, could we, if the chain CPI is successful, and heaven forbid that it is, we will be seeing a lot of hardship and human suffering.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, economics, like any academic thing, and we've seen it with global warming, that it's about dissenting views and then, finally conclusion is reached. So, of course, you can find economists who say that this is the right thing to do, but they're just part of a larger debate, and they have not necessarily won it, and it's not really hard to see that in the long run. Of course, they're wrong, because you're taking money out of the economy. So now Phyllis's landlord may not get that extra rent, and he won't be able to do whatever else he does with it. There's a multiplier effect. I mean, just listening to Phyllis talk here, going back to healthcare, I made the case it should be emotional, and people should really understand what the personal pain that people go through. But there's also a top-level just spreadsheet argument, which is, I mean, and I'm sure Phyllis could testify to this. Imagine if she didn't have that $4,000 doctor bill. What could she have done with that $4,000 that would have been much more productive to the economy? If she didn't have to be an unpaid full-time caregiver and guardian of medical records and trying to do all these things, what else would she have had the time to do? And so it's, I think, if you kind of clear through the fog, a very intuitive argument about if people have more money, they will spend more money. If their time isn't sucked up by these things, they will have more time to put into the economy and be productive.
George Zornick from The Nation. Phyllis, I'm going to give you the last word. Anything you'd like to share before we go?
Well, I would like to say something about the morality issue of all this. And I think, unfortunately, the Ayn Rand devotees, whose attitudes are every man for himself, have been gaining seats in Congress. And is that the kind of society we want to live in and to teach our children?
Thank you very much, Phyllis. I think
You're
that
welcome.
you asked the central question, and that is that the notion of pull yourself up by your own bootstrap, individualism, rugged individualism. And is that what we really need as a nation? In fact, is that what we've had? And can we continue to survive as a country if we elect people whose governing ethos ascribes to that ideology? So thank you very much, Phyllis, for your insightful commentary today and for sharing your story.
And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
All right. You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We'll be right back after the break.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Social Security and Medicare. These programs touch the lives of virtually every American family. Yet with so much misinformation out there, Americans are pretty confused about their future. You deserve the truth. For more than 30 years, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare has been leading the fight to preserve our nation's most successful programs. Join us and find out how to keep Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid strong for all generations. Learn more online at thetruthnow.org.
This is John Bauman. You know me best as Bowser, formerly of the group Sha Na Na. But these days, I'm rocking and rolling nationwide as part of the Truth Tour with the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Some politicians claim they want to protect Medicare, but the truth is they support the Romney-Ryan Coupon Care Plan, which would end traditional Medicare. This could raise our health care costs as much as $500 more each month. Ending Medicare doesn't protect it. Learn the facts and join our national campaign at thetruthnow.org.
Local station WLS broadcasts a radio host who repeatedly attacked a female student for no other reason than her participation in a public debate about women's health. She told elected officials about various ways her classmates rely on prescription birth control, including a story about a friend who takes it to manage ovarian cysts. For this, the radio host called her a slut, in addition to 45 other personal attacks.
Miss Fluke, have you ever heard of not having sex? She's having so much sex, it's amazing she can still walk. She's having so much sex, she's going broke buying contraceptives and wants us to buy them. It makes her a slut, right? Makes her a prostitute. She wants to be paid to have sex. If we are going to pay for your contraceptives and thus pay for you to have sex, we want you to post the videos online so we can all watch.
WLS shouldn't talk about women this way. Our community deserves better than this. This community service announcement was paid for by Media Matters for America.
Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. So we've been talking about the chain CPI, its austerity measure that they're seeking to impose, and we know that it has a differential effect on different populations. And here to talk about the impact of the chain CPI on Latinos is Eva Dominguez. She is the executive director at Latinos for Secure Retirement. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Maya. Thank you for having me on the show and for discussing such an important matter for Latinos, particularly Latino seniors.
Yeah, you are very welcome. Tell us about how the chain CPI will affect Latino seniors. Mm-hmm.
Well, for one thing, it will disproportionately affect Latinos, and that's for two reasons. Well, for several reasons, but one of which is that Latinos tend to live longer. They have a higher than average life expectancy. And the other reason, a major reason, is that Latinos have lower incomes. They have, for instance, for Social Security, the average Latino senior has about $12,491 in Social Security benefits. So they have a little under $13,000 for a male Latino senior. The female Latino senior makes about $10,400 or so dollars in Social Security benefits a year. And, you know, for whites, the amount is a little under $15,000. Mm-hmm. So they have lower incomes when they lower Social Securities when they retire, due to a very large extent that the jobs that they work in tend to be lower wages.
Right.
Besides that, they also have and as a result of that, they also depend a lot more on Social Security. 77% of Latino households over 65 depend on Social Security for a majority of their income. That's 3 out of 4 Latinos that depend on Social Security for more than 50% of their income. And even more striking, 55% of Latino households rely on it for 90% of their income. So these people, basically, that's pretty much all they have.
Right.
And the thing is that Latinos don't necessarily have employer-provided pension plans or other government pension. Only, I should say, less than 20% of Latinos have this versus almost 50% of whites.
Right.
Latinos also don't tend to contribute to 401k plans. Only about 25% of Latinos actually put money away in a 401k plan versus more than 50% of whites. So Social Security is extremely important to them. So the little bit that they're getting, they really need. They need that for, to be able to pay their rent. They need that to take care of their health.
Right.
And the important thing about the chain CPI is that it has a cumulative effect. So after 20 years, the Latino senior would end up losing $7,000, almost $8,000 in benefit, and the female Latina a little over $6,000 that they would lose, after being on this for like 20 years.
So Eva, the White House would argue that, we understand that those who are very long-lived would actually be very harmed by this benefit, and they're going to argue that is why we've created a special exemption for the very old. That special exemption, some people are calling a birthday bump, that would hold harmless those 76 and above. What is your critique of the birthday bump?
Well, it would definitely help a little bit, but it wouldn't be such a big help, and that is because it would be phased in over 10 years. There was a study that was done by the National Women's Law Center, and they found that, first of all, the bump would start at your 75th birthday.
Right.
And for a typical woman making $13,200, and, this is a typical white woman. Remember, a Latino is only making $10,000 a year in Social Security benefits. They found that the bump up would be equivalent to $6.70 a month. And it would, on the 10th year, it would go up to $67 a month. So it would creep up very slowly, this extra help that they would get.
Right.
And then at 85, again, the benefits would start going down, and they wouldn't get another bump until they're 95 years old. Mm-hmm. So this, while it would help some, it still doesn't make up for all the lost benefits for all those years, for all those 10 years before and then the following 10 years. So it would be definitely better than not having it. But the truth is that, the idea that, and I know some of your callers were talking about this, the idea that seniors are getting overpaid in their cost of living is kind of laughable. When you think that, seniors, Latinos and, everyone, seniors in general spend 3 times as much on their health care than the rest of, the population and the under 65. And, there's the chain CPI is based on the idea that you could substitute for something cheaper, that, that people, when prices go up, they'll get something cheaper. Well, that may be okay. I mean, if the price of steak goes up, you might be able to substitute for hamburger. But if you're someone that's suffering from rheumatoid arthritis and you have to pay for these drugs that cost about $1,000 a month, like Remicade, some of these biologics, you can't really, what are you going to do? What are you going to substitute for? There's no generic for that.
Eva,
and so,
Yeah, I think that you are absolutely right to focus on this. The threat of the chain CPI for Latino populations is very real for all of the issues that you talked about in terms of having a higher reliance on, heavier dependence on Social Security benefits, having a higher life expectancy. But the overall, give us you've alluded to the racial and ethnic wealth gap with regards to having less access to pensions when you do have access to pensions, actually contributing at a lower rate or not contributing at all. Can you give us a sense of what the overall retirement security picture is for the Latino population?
Well, it's very much reliant on Social Security, and it doesn't look like it's getting any better. I mean, it's not like 10 years down the road, all of a sudden, Latino seniors are going to find a pot of gold that's going to help them through their retirement years. So they're starting off, with a lower Social Security benefit without any other outside, type of pension benefit. And so, if you start cutting their benefits, it's going to, and start raising their health care, because that's the other part, is that not only are they talking about this chain CPI, but they're also talking about basically increasing premiums for beneficiaries. They're talking about basically putting on a surcharge, increasing the deductible, charging home health copays. And, like when you think about the Latino population, most of them work in low-income jobs. They work in hard physical labor jobs that wear and tear their bodies down. And many of them, by the time they reach 65, they're suffering from chronic health conditions. Something that might not be that well known is that Latinos have a much higher incidence of diabetes. And in fact, if you look in Chicago, which is one of the highest places of diabetes around the country, Latinos had, 25% of Latinos had diabetes versus 15% of whites. And so, when you have chronic conditions and when you have, when you have to deal with diabetes, all of this increases your cost of health care.
Right.
And, and the thing is that there are things that we can do to reduce the cost of healthcare. And what we shouldn't be doing is basically shifting the cost onto beneficiaries. And that's what seems to be happening, is that these proposals, the co-payments on home health, you're basically shifting the cost on. And, I know your caller earlier was, the person you had on earlier, I believe her name was Phyllis, was talking about how we pay so much more for our health care. I mean, we pay twice as much as other industrialized countries.
Right.
And so what we need to be doing is focusing on things that will help reduce the cost of health care.
Right.
Instead of shifting it on to Latinos or, whites or, anyone else. We shouldn't be doing that.
My last question for you, because we do have to go, is this issue of cost shifting and the generational effect. As you know, Latino immigration is actually driving the changing demographics of our nation, and the U.S. Census Bureau projects that by the year 2043, the nation will be majority, quote-unquote, minority. And so when you look at the fact that a lot of these changes that they're proposing to implement will really have an impact on the rising majority, if you will, in a negative way, there is a racial element to some of these policies. Would you not agree?
Yes. I mean, I don't think perhaps it's not intentional, but I think it will. I mean, it's definitely, when you look at who is going to be affected by it, who's going to be, it's going to be people that have low incomes. It's not going to be these CEOs that have, socked away, millions in pensions. I mean, there was a study recently of these CEOs that had like $45 million in pension. Another health CEO had $11 million. I mean, these people are not going to be hurt by these policies. I mean, these people, the one with the $45 million pension, he's going to be able to get $250,000 a month in pension. Whereas you're talking about the average Latino that's maybe getting, be lucky if they'll get like $1,200 a month in Social Security. So, that's the problem, is that, it's going to definitely end up hurting the low income.
Class, ethnicity, gender, I think all of these factors actually have an impact. Exactly. So thank you, Eva, for joining us, and congratulations on your new position as Executive Director at Latinos for a Secure Retirement.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.
I look forward to working with you. Take care.
Same here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And next we'll hear from Tim Carpenter. He is the National Director at Progressive Democrats of America on what you've been doing lately and how to execute an inside-outside strategy. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Maya. How are you? Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, gosh, I'm doing well. How are you?
We're having the time of our lives. A little busy. Big show today, huh?
Yeah, very much so. Thanks for coming on. So listen, Tim, the progressives in the Congress have been trying to, in some respects, or at least a slice of them, toe the line when it comes to, defending the nation's social insurance programs, particularly the big three, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And as you well know, this notion of a grand bargain and using a grand bargain as the way out of us, or using austerity as a way to reduce deficits and debt, has been the policy preference of the Washington elite of both parties. And so I know that the Progressive Democrats of America have been trying to find and help Democrats find their true north, if you will. And how do you actually propose to do that?
Well, we're certainly looking for that North Star. Well, this struggle really began during the Bull-Simpson debate, as you know, Maya, when we were fighting simply to get the whole discussion of moving from austerity to prosperity. We simply can't cut our way out of this. We've got to put the military into the formula, and it was back then that Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky led the fight. While the president was not successful through the Bull-Simpson Commission to get the cuts he wanted on Social Security, we fast forward now 14, 15 months later, and here we are. As you've done today on your program, so eloquently laid out for everybody the attacks on Social Security that simply not need to be the chain CPI and so forth. So for us, within Progressive Democrats of America, it's very simple. We have to shift this debate away from austerity to prosperity. We've begun that in earnest. Last week, Congressmember Keith Ellison reintroduced the Robin Hood tax, known as the, right now that's currently been reintroduced into the House, is the Inclusionary Property Act to tax Wall Street to begin a revenue stream. That's H.R. 1579. And then more importantly, as you said throughout the day today, those progressives, we sometimes forget there are 73 members that are self-identified within the Progressive Caucus that call themselves progressives. And of those, 41, through the leadership of Alan Grayson and Mark Takano, have signed a letter that we are really organizing around right now, is to hold the line on Social Security, whether it be on the chain CPI or simply not to raise the retirement age. So that's where the fight is right now. We were in 107 congressional district offices last month. We plan to be on May 15th again. So we hopefully can take all of this knowledge today and take it out into the streets. We need an active, progressive community out in the streets and in those congressional offices to let those members know that we're going to hold them accountable on this important fight.
So what does that mean? Because I have to push you. I had Congressman Grayson on a couple of weeks ago, and he actually indicated, I asked him, there were only 41 members on his letter. What about the other progressives? What do you think that this says? He says that he thought that actually they should be primaried.
Progressive Democrats of America was founded in 2004 in that belief. We went after Alan Wynn and helped elect Donna Edwards. We were very active in the electoral cycles of 2004, 2006, again with Christine Segalis out in Illinois when Rahm Emanuel, the head of the D-Trip, was trying to push, at that time, Tammy Baldwin. We think we need a primary fight. We think this party will be much stronger with the primary fight. We were found on that basis. We are the insurgency. We're certainly not the Democratic Party. It's unconscionable that we're even having this discussion. Those members that are standing up have made it very clear this is something we should be proud of as Social Security. This is our legacy. This is FDR and LBJ when we talk about Medicare, when we talk about Medicaid. The fight is inside our own party. So those 41 are the ones we need to surround and increase those numbers. We jokingly sometimes inside Progressive Democrats of America find ourselves really being the progressive wing of the Progressive Caucus. So yeah, we're truly in a fight for the heart and soul of our party. This began when Barack Obama was elected. We had no illusions that he was a progressive. He threw single payer under the fight. Just as we were in congressional offices last month fighting to protect Social Security, we were there to remind folks that Congressman John Conyers has reintroduced H.R. 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All Act. We should be talking about expanding these programs, not cutting them. That's why we're aligning ourselves with Alan Grayson, and we certainly do have a fight within our own party.
Okay, so say this. If somehow the president manages to get certain Democrats on board with a chain CPI proposal, a balanced approach is what he's calling it, if he manages to get the Republicans to come along, and if somehow this thing passes, what is the next step?
Well, we don't get to that point without a good fight. So until we get there, we need to make sure on May 15th, everybody who's frustrated on this fight gets out in the streets, goes to their offices. This is not the time to be on the sidelines. It's not time to shut down and leave the Democratic Party. The fight is inside our party. Jim Hightower, who many of your listeners know, the former agricultural commissioner out in Texas, who's part of our advisory board, probably one of the leading populists in this fight, often says, we don't need a third party, we need a second party. So the fight's inside this party, Maya. If we lose this particular fight, we keep struggling. We make sure in 2014 that we get out in the streets and we organize and we elect more progressive Democrats. We know simply by electing Democrats we're not going to get to where we need. We need progressive Democrats. We need to look back on this last election cycle and realize we came in less than 1,000 votes to elect Dr. David Gill out in Illinois, who was a single-payer doctor. What would have happened if the progressive community would have gone that extra mile out there, or if we were successful in Northern California and received another 200 votes to get Norman Solomon into the general election out in Northern California to replace Lynn Woolsey? We've got to get engaged in congressional races across this country where we can send people to Congress like Alan Grayson and Mark Takano who are going to hold the line for us and fight inside our party. So if we happen to lose this fight, we simply don't give up. We roll up our sleeves and we struggle and we organize and we mobilize.
And so my last question for you is, do you have any high-profile New Democrat targets?
At this point in time, we'd like to see David Gill return. As I said, he came very close when he ran for re-election. The good news for us is to begin to look out over the landscape right now. As you said, 2014 begins now in earnest. We encourage folks to visit pdamerica.org, look at the website. Between now and Tuesday, we have a chance to elect a really good progressive to go to the U.S. Senate. So let's stay focused on the short term. Between now and Tuesday, let's make sure we get Ed Markey on his way to the U.S. Senate and begin there.
Thank you, Tim Carpenter, National Director at Progressive Democrats of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. Have a good one.
All right. So, thanks to each of my guests and my listening audience for joining me for yet another edition of Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore. I'd also like to thank my producer, Peter James Callahan, and our show's sponsor, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Please join us every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time at 1480 a.m. in Washington, D.C., or listen anywhere in the world on weactradio.com. Until next time, America.
This is John Bauman. You know me best as Bowser, formerly of the group Sha Na Na. And you know, when we were rocking and rolling all those years ago, I wasn't particularly worrying about my retirement or how I'd pay for health care. But now that I'm 65, I really understand the importance of Medicare, not just for myself, but for generations of working Americans who need secure health care as they get older. That's why this election is so important. The Romney-Ryan Coupon Care Plan will mean the end of traditional Medicare. It gives seniors a partial payment which loses value over time and raises our health care costs as much as $500 more each month. Coupon Care also puts us at the mercy of private insurers, making it harder to pick our own doctors. All of this to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy? Are you kidding me? Americans of all ages say no to Coupon Care. Bum 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 dang a dang dang ding a dong ding. Preserve Medicare.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.